Hey everyone, it's Teresa. Welcome to my channel. Today we are going to do a stamps and stamping video for beginners. We're going to look at different types of stamps, different types of ink pads, and how to use them together. This is just the bare basics of how to get stamping. There are many other ways to use stamps, and we'll look at that in future videos. So let's have a look at what you are going to need. You are going to need obviously stamps, and I've got many different types of stamps here. You're going to need stamp pads. And I have pigment based and ink or dye based, and then you are going to need stamping blocks. This is acrylic stamping blocks, and they come in different sizes and thicknesses. You're going to need obviously paper or something to stamp on. This is a stamp chamois, and this is what I use to clean my stamps. It is much better for your stamps to clean with something like this instead of like baby wipes or just a dry piece of paper, because that would leave fiber. So a stamp chamois or a car chamois that you've just got up does the same job. Okay, that's just for cleaning your stamps. So let's look at stamps. So you get red rubber stamps. This is the Cling Mount red rubber stamp. This is also a red rubber stamp, but this is already mounted on a wooden block. This is still available, these wooden blocks, but they're a little bit more old school type stamps. Most of your stamps these days are the Cling Mount stamps, so you'll recognize your red rubber stamps, you'll recognize your polymer, photopolymer rubber stamp. These are also called silicone stamps, but they're basically a photopolymer. So they are all Cling Mount, meaning they cling to the little mounting block, and your mounting block is an acrylic block, and this is what you use to stamp. So let's look at ink pads. I have two types of ink pads here. Now, this is not an exhaustive list of all the type of ink pads that are available out there. This is the ones I use mostly, and they represent two different types of ink pads: pigment-based ink pads and dye-based or ink-based ink pads. Now, to understand this a little bit better, I've got this little experiment for you here. This is hot water and a tea bag, and this is baby powder and just plain water. Okay, this way around. So your tea bag here is going to represent dye-based ink pads, and your baby powder is going to represent your pigment-based ink pads. So let's look at dye-based first. Dye-based ink pads do the following. This is pomegranate tea, lovely, yum yum. So once I put the tea bag in there, it's going to steep, and it's going to become, this is not water anymore, now it's tea. Okay, you won't be able to take tea out of this. You won't be able to take the red, the tea, the flavor, the tannins, whatever the tea has got in it, you won't be able to take that out of the water. This has now gone from plain water to tea. Okay, and that is what dye-based or ink-based stamp pads do. They actually dye or color or stain the substrate. So they actually pull into the fibers of the substrate, and they actually color it. And that is why you'd sometimes get a lot of bleed through on the back of your page with dye-based ink pads, because they actually color the actual substrate that you're working on. They pull into the fibers. When you look at pigment-based ink pads, pigment, let's get some baby powder. Pigment always sits on top of the substrate. It never colors, dyes, or stains the substrate. Like you can see here, it's just sitting on top of the surface of the water. It's not going through to the rest of the water. It's just gathered on top here. So pigment-based ink pads always sit on top of your paper, and that's why you don't always get bleed through on the back of your pages when you use pigment-based ink pads. So which ink pad would you want to use? Well, that really depends on what you are working with. For my mixed media type of work, I prefer just dye-based ink pads because they are permanent. Pigment-based ink pads sometimes smudge and smear, but that also depends on the surface that you're working on. This is just a journal. It's got very porous paper, And this is pigment ink that I stamped here, and I was able to watercolor over this and it did not smear. So sometimes when you work on very porous surfaces like papers, it actually doesn't matter what you use, you can still watercolor over it. But when you get to non-porous surfaces, and this is UPO paper, which is essentially plastic, all the dye-based or ink-based stamp pads, they are permanent. They're actually made for more non-porous surfaces, and they are made so that you can use water on top of them. These ones have been stamped a couple of days ago and they still smudge. They still smear and smudge, and this was the pigment-based ink pad. So pigment-based ink pads are more for porous surfaces where you don't want bleed through to the back of your page, and dye-based are more for permanent stamping on any surface. But with non-porous surfaces, you also don't get any smears when you go over it with water or your finger. But the problem with dye-based ink pads is that you will get bleeding through to the back of the page because the ink just goes through all the fibers. Okay, so it really depends on what project you are working with. There are as many types of stamp pads and colors as there are stars in the sky, so that really just depends what you prefer, what brands you like working with, and the colors that you want to work with. So I've talked a lot about bleed through and which ink pads bleed through and which don't, so I'm just going to actually show you. So we'll take our little leaf stamp. This is a scrap piece of paper. It's actually quite a thin piece of paper. This is layout paper. I think it's 40 GSM. There's also, you can also see this on copier paper. I just thought it on camera, this one will actually show up better. So first one I'm going to stamp is a dye-based ink. So we're going to ink this up. Fairy footsteps. With dye-based ink, I'm going to stamp. Even pressure. Alright, and then I'm going to clean it off, and then we're going to stamp it in a pigment ink. So let's do red, just show you what's shadowing, the difference between shadowing and bleed through. So this is pigment ink. Pigment ink pads are normally a lot more juicy, so you'll have to press a little bit softer to get actual ink on the stamp. They also normally have a sponge, where dye-based normally has the felt pad. Okay, so let's turn that around. Let's get something white behind. Okay, so can you see bleed through compared to shadowing? Even these ones that I've stamped, they were pigment ink pads. So that's what bleed through is. You can see that the ink has actually come through the paper and actually colored the paper. You can see blotches of ink coming through. This one you can see there's something stamped on the background because it's such a thin piece of paper, but it's not bleed through. That's just shadowing because you can see that there was something done on the other side of the page. So if you hold it like that, you can also see the difference between bleed through and shadowing. So let's look at inking up a stamp pad. So I'm going to take one of my acrylic blocks, I'm going to take one of my photopolymer stamps, and I'm going to ink it up so that I can stamp with it. The best way to do this is to actually put your stamp down, take your stamp pad, and this is pigment ink, this is a Versamagic chalk ink, so this is pigment ink, and I am going to gently, fairy footsteps, add my ink to my stamp. And with the pigment ink, it's actually quite easy to see that your stamp is all inked up. And then I'm going to stamp it down. Even pressure, not too hard, just even pressure, and there you go. Beautifully inked up. What you don't want to do is take your stamp on your stamp block in your hand and press down onto the stamp. Okay, so what this does is, I've tested it. You always, for some other reason, always press too hard when you do this. And then you're starting to get ink into the recessed areas. And that will just create blotching. Okay, and you'll get thick lines instead of the nice fine, because this is a really fine detailed stamp. Instead of getting nice fine details, you're going to get quite thick blotchy areas when you do it that way. Let's just look at how a stamp is actually created. So a stamp is basically either the red rubber stamps or the photopolymer stamps is basically a raised area and a recessed area. The raised area is what makes the picture, and that's the area that you want to get ink on. And that's why it's important to actually put the stamp down. This is a dye-based ink pad. Take your ink pad and ink up your stamp. This way you can't get too much ink on the recessed areas, because you tend to be more gentle doing it this way around. So we always want to, fairy footsteps, ink up the stamp pad. We don't want to stamp the ink pad. Okay, you've got a lot more control of where you are putting the ink. Okay. And then even pressure, and there we go. So that's the bare basics of what stamping is. It is that easy. You have a stamp, you have a stamp pad, you ink up the stamp, you stamp it on your paper, and there you have a picture. Okay, so there's so many ways and things that you can do with stamps and stamping and pictures and all of that. I'm just going to show you two fun techniques today. The first one is when you use second generation stamping. So again, taking my block, I've got a stamp here. Now what you will notice is that this stamp is actually stained green, and this stamp is still very much clean. Let's just clean it off properly. Okay, so this one is, I've only ever used pigment ink on it just because that was what I used. This one I've already actually used dye-based ink on it, and that's why it's stained. It does not mean it's dirty. Okay, dye-based ink pads will stain your stamps. So if you look at these ones, this stamp I've obviously not used with my permanent ink pads yet. Okay, so these ones, they're all clean. There's nothing coming off them. They're clean. But what happened is I used permanent ink with them, or dye-based ink pads, and now they are stained. That's not a problem. Once you've cleaned it off, they're perfectly fine. Nothing's going to happen to them. I can just show you. Let's take this one. We'll take, this is dye-based ink pad. It is archival. Okay, it's a dark brown. I'm going to ink that one up. Let's stamp it on this page. I'm going to stamp it. Okay, there's my stamp. Nice, fine, thin detail. And now I'm going to take my stamp chamois, clean it off, and now you can see it is stained. Nothing wrong with the stamp. It's just that, remember, dye-based ink pads stain whatever they go onto, including your fingers, your clothes, your table, your craft mat. Everything gets stained with dye-based ink pads. Pigment-based ink pads, if you only ever use pigment-based ink pads, your stamps will always be nice and clean and clear. So let's take this one for instance, and we'll use the red. This is a pigment-based ink pad. It is red. I had a lot of control. I watched that I could put my ink everywhere I need it. Stamping down, and I'm going to take my stamp chamois, and it's clean and clear again. No staining, not like this one now. Okay, that just shows that's gonna happen with ink, with dye-based ink pads. Just keep that in mind. Okay, all right, so what I wanted to show you is how to work with second generation stamping. So I'm going to take this one of mine, and let's use this turquoise color. So once you've inked up your ink pad and you stamp it the first time, that's your first stamp. But now I can go and I can stamp it a second time, and that is my second generation stamping. Now what that gives you is it gives you the opportunity to actually work with one stamp pad in two different colors. Say for instance I wanted to stamp red, but I didn't want it to be super vibrant red. I can ink up my stamp pad, I'm going to first stamp it off on a separate piece of paper, and then I'm going to come in with my stamp. I'm going to stamp it again. Can you see that it's much lighter than that first initial stamp? Okay, so that's a way that you can play and get almost like two types of color out of one ink pad. Alright, so that's second generation stamping. A lot of people like doing second generation stamping to actually create drop shadows for their titles. So we're going to stamp, move it a little and stamp again. So I've created a little drop shadow for my sentiment. Okay, so that's just one fun way that you can use your stamps. The next one we're going to look at is we are going to actually create a little mask. So I've already have a mask. I've actually used this flower quite a bit for this technique. So I make my mask and I keep them. So how do you do that? So I've got my stamp block here with my stamp on, and now I'm going to ink it up, and I'm going to have a scrap piece of paper. And you're going to stamp this flower on scrap piece of paper, and you're going to cut it out, and then this is what you get. You get a little mask. So how do you use your little mask? Let's carry on with this one. So I normally keep my masks, I keep them in the same box that I store my stamps. You don't have to, you can make a new mask every time. I just like, it's done once, so I'll just keep it. So now I'm just going to line up my mask to my stamp. I'm going to ink up my stamp again. There we go. And now that the mask is down, I can overlap this stamp with the previous one. And I'm going to get it the effect where the one flower looks like it's behind the first flower. So this gives you that 3D effect, and you can build a really nice, you can do that even with leaves. So we want leaves. Where did I put the leaves? There they are. So we've decided we want leaves, but we want only some of the leaves to stick out behind the flower. So I'm going to just line up my mask again. There we go. I'm going to ink up my leaves. So you can create a whole bouquet of flowers. You might need quite a few different masks. So this part that's overlapping onto the mask is going to stamp this ink off. And I have my leaves peeking out behind my flower. Now yes, you can go sit and you can ink this up. Ink it up. And you can take your chamois and you can wipe off the excess at the bottom, and then hope you can see where the excess was placed, and then go and overlap. And this time I did it perfectly, but sometimes you can't get it perfectly and you actually stamp the two over each other, and then it's just starts creating like blotches of ink. Let me show you what that would look like. It's going to be very difficult to try and wipe this flower clean in exactly that shape. It's easier with the leaves. It's not going to be so easy with these. So again, we'll put the mask on. So the one flower is going to get mask and the one is not going to have a mask. And that will just show you. Okay, so again, This piece here, beautifully masked off. This flower looks like it's behind that one, but here it's just a massive overlap of ink and stripes, and that gets all like muddy, you could almost say. Okay, so that just shows you how you can play with masks and stamps. So one of my favorite ways to actually use stamps is to actually watercolor in them. So I've stamped this one with permanent ink, used my watercolors, and I've colored it in. You can do card making like that, or this can just be a creative activity for the day if you want to unwind. So there's so much that you can do with stamps. There are so many different ways that you can ink up stamps. You can use almost any color medium, and if you're interested in seeing how you can ink up stamps with watercolor pencils, acrylic ink, acrylic paint, anything like that, just let me know and I'll do a video. Thank you everyone for joining, and I'll speak to you soon.